Welcome to Dialogue, Busani. So what do people identify as probably the major challenge to, in particular, I would say, the global south? We're talking about the BRICS, mostly developing countries here.
Well, what happens to the dollar as a reserve currency has a major impact on countries of the global south at different levels. Countries use it for trade when they settle accounts, when they are trading. So whatever happens to it and its value has an impact on their ability to settle. In the majority of cases, what happens to it also tends to affect the strength of the currencies in countries in the global south, to the extent that you may be a country that may be dependent on commodities, or you may have some kind of an infant industry that has emerged, and we are exporting those goods, and we are settling then those accounts using the dollar. What happens to the dollar will have a direct impact. There are many countries in the global south that are industrializing. They have to import equipment and machinery. And if they do so when their currencies are very weak, it becomes very expensive for them to do so because they are trading in the dollar. Because we understand that most of the challenges, even of inflation and the value of the currencies in the global south, is actually imported. It depends on what happens in the United States. In South Africa, where I come from, for example, you can see that our own inflation and interest rates, they track very closely what happens in the US. But as we know, what is money used for? Money is used, you save the money, you exchange, when you are trading with other people, you also take loans in particular currencies. And when weaker economies are then using a particular currency that can shift for their own domestic issues, it ends up having an impact on your own real economy as a country. It then becomes a challenge. And we've seen it happens in many countries. It happens in South Africa, in Latin America. It even happens actually in Europe and countries like Japan, because it has a direct impact on the real economies of those countries because it is a reserve currency. And that is why the 2008 global economic crisis, which was essentially a banking crisis of the United States, but as a reserve currency country, it ended up affecting the entire global economy. And that is why there has to be a rethink of the international financial architecture.
The stability of this international financial monetary system, the financial system there, of course, mostly because of the appreciation of the US dollars over the past couple of years. And it is very strong. That caused a lot of challenges for other countries, in particular developing countries. What about paying debt in US dollar terms?
Well, debt is a big issue for many developing countries. Some of them currently, they are now looking for resources because they may have fiscal deficits. Some of them, they needed to fund real infrastructure. You may remember that about 15 years ago or so, there was a global alliance on the issue of debt relief for many countries in the global south. My own reading of a situation is that in the next 5 years, we will be back there. We will now be talking about debt relief precisely because of what you are saying. Because in the majority of cases, it is unsustainable. And developing countries have a challenge, the challenge of development. There is a pressure amongst the citizens and other stakeholders for them to develop, to industrialize, to build infrastructure. And in many instances, this money has to be borrowed because we need capital to deploy in order to industrialize, build infrastructure, and so on. So the terms of this capital, and if it's dollar denominated, eventually will be felt by these economies. Hence, in my own view, in the next 5 years, we will see a resurgence of the conversation that was taking place in the past decade or so of debt relief. And at the current rate, I think in the next 5 years, that will be the biggest chorus globally, that there has to be debt relief for countries in the global south.
As a former executive director at IMF, Paulo Batista pointed out, the use and abuse of the US dollar's privileged position is leading to a loss of legitimacy. of the prevailing international monetary system. On one hand, the US is a public good. On the other hand, you do see a legitimacy issue. You agree?
Well, the IMF senior personnel was very correct, because that feeling is there, and you can see it come from someone who works within the system. Because there is an expectation in many countries that you have to democratize the global the financial system. If it is not, because the trend is, even with the IMF being part of that system, it's not being democratized. It's based on those who've got hegemony, those who've got power, those who've got the influence, which means that your voice as a small country that is desperate to develop, you are unable to influence, or the decisions they make are not in the best interest of all countries, regardless of the sizes of their economies and so on. So it is correct that there is an abuse, because by using unilateralism in deciding whether we are sanctioning, whether you are freezing people's assets, and so on, you then undermine the legitimacy of the system. And that is why the calls, especially in Africa, is also democratize the international financial system.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at this, or some people call it, BRICS Bank, basically the new development bank, NDB. Their goal is to increase local currency lending from about 22% to 30% by 2026. Is that the right direction, basically to increase the use of?
Oh, that's great. That's great. That is why the bank exists, because there are realities in these countries. The reality of their own currency, their performance in relation to other currencies in the bigger trading system. The BRICS Bank is a very interesting and exciting institution that has been established, because, as I said earlier on, the idea is how you democratize the international financial system. And having a BRICS Bank, as we have now, is already extending credit and so on. You are in fact taking a major step toward democratizing, because what it means is a country can now choose that I'm going to be building this infrastructure. I can either build it using credit from the IMF or some other Euro-American based institutions, or I can go into the BRICS Bank, whose orientation is purely developmental. And that's an exciting thing about the bank. And interacting with the president on Monday was very interesting, because those are the type of things that are priority for her and the team that she leads.
Development-oriented, do you think there's any awareness on the side of Washington? People are not happy with our sort of like hegemony or monopoly of the US dollar, or abuse of the privilege having the US dollar and the people's dependence on the US dollar. And then what if they readjust? Okay, let's have less unilateral sanctions so people can better use US dollars. Do you think there's still incentive for developing countries to pursue a different path maybe?
It's very difficult to tell what's going on in the US and so on. And there could be different reasons why things are happening the way they are doing, which it might as well be that the kind of intellectual class, thinking class, that supported the growth and the sustainability of the American system, maybe that thinking class is gone. There's a lot of ridiculousness that is going on there. The type of discussions that you see happening sometimes in Congress, like these people are elected to discuss this type of stuff, whereas when the world is facing much bigger issues. When you follow some of the key economic thinkers, of course there are some who are studying what's happening to the currencies and so on. But in some instances you feel like that class that was thinking, that was solutioning, that was imagining, even if it was to do that in pursuit of strengthening the empire, it's almost like that class has given up. And what you have now in many conversations, if you read and hear what they say, is using very hard form of statecraft, hegemonic statecraft. It's either it's a military operation, or that the currency will be used, and of course control of information technology and other things. And that today, I mean, who will imagine that a country that has been the champion of the global free market system and so on and trade, that they can impose sanctions at 100? Because, I mean, what we have learned in economics is that you can introduce some type of tariffs and you can progressively, if you think it is not working. I've never heard of like 100% in a manner in which it is happening. So I do think that there is a challenge with the intellectual and the thinking class in the US and how they are providing advice and shaping opinion that eventually translates into public policy there.
That's what I'm going to ask, of course, previously we say the US officials, governments used to talk basically, lecturing the world, you may say, about free trade, about globalization, but now they are withdrawing from globalization. You see, they turn to protectionism. And what's the relationship between free trade and then the use of dollar, let's say? And now the US is turning inward, sort of. And do you foresee probably less use of US dollar globally?
I think under the circumstances, I mean, if we read the pattern, I think that is where the shift is moving. Because countries need to trade. And as they need to trade, they need to find alternatives. So what will be those alternatives? And if the alternative for two countries to trade and do business, if the alternative is to use a different currency, I think that's what the countries will do. I don't think countries will just immediately subject themselves to having assets frozen or higher tariffs and so on, and not react to it, because those things have an impact on their economy. So I think that is how in the end this will pan out.
Thank you, Busani.